Hello and good morning, everyone, and welcome to your morning briefing for Thursday, the 10th of April, 2025. I'm your host, Mike Shelby. And by the way, sorry, Jared's out today, so Jared's internet's not working. So he normally runs the show, which is why there's no waiting room music. All right, Robert, good morning. Let's go ahead and jump inside the Beltway here. Let's start over in the House. What's going on?
Good morning, Mike. So House Speaker Mike Johnson is going to try to push through this debt ceiling or this budget reconciliation bill today after they postponed it yesterday due to disagreements over these unfunded tax cuts and House members who want, or House Republicans who want more spending cuts than the Senate is put in this bill. But the reason why this bill is important is because it includes I think, $4 or $5 trillion debt ceiling raise, and the Congress is going to leave for a 2-week Easter recess into this week. And I think the timing of this, plus the dissent within the Republican Party over these tax cuts and fights over these spending cuts, is likely to delay raising the debt ceiling ahead of this, the possible exit date in May. And we could see a situation where there's a debt ceiling fight. And I think there's a possibility that the Democrats will attempt to force a breach of the debt ceiling.
I agree. That's one of the big things that I'm getting from groups like Indivisible and 5051 and the rest is they say they're successfully pushing Democrats to take more aggressive action here against the Trump administration. All right, so the House and Senate, they're on 2-week recess. They get back late April, early May, and then they've got presumably maybe less than 30 days to hammer out the bill. All right, thanks, Robert. Let's move on to some news on the tax front.
Yeah, Trump issued an executive order yesterday. He's directing the federal government to create what he's calling a maritime action plan. And this would be an assessment of both government and private sector options to boost U.S. shipbuilding, the maritime industrial base. And this also, in this order, he's directing the defense secretary to develop a strategy to secure Arctic waterways, which is another sign that the Trump administration is pivoting to the Arctic, as well as this China containment strategy that has been pushed since January.
Mm-hmm. You know, that Arctic thing is part of Fortress America. Not only does it include Greenland, but also the Northwest Passage, which is territory I believe right now mostly belongs to Canada. All right, and then finally, let's talk about Chinese economic containment, because this is the message that I'm getting also, especially from Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent. He was on Tucker last week. I talked about it, I think, yesterday. And he said China's economic recovery depends on ramping up exports. Bessent said they're in a recession/depression, and they're trying to increase their exports. He said we cannot allow them to do that. That sounds like economic warfare to me. At a minimum, containment, and that's your point this morning. This is an economic containment strategy. So what's the latest?
So Bessent yesterday, he said that the Trump administration is making new trade deals with some of our allies, and the idea is to lay a groundwork for a unified trade front against China. And this was after yesterday, President Trump announced a 90-day delay on these reciprocal tariffs and also ramped up tariffs on China. And now we're at 125% for Chinese imports. And from what I'm seeing, there are increasing indicators that the Trump administration is engaging in a purposeful strategy to contain China's economy and their industrial base. Because there's been a lot of media coverage about this announcement yesterday from Trump, saying that he blinked that this was due to market volatility and people in his orbit, especially in Wall Street, reaching out to try to get him to reverse these tariffs. But I think this is a purposeful strategy. And a key pillar of this is presenting a unified trade strategy with U.S. allies and trade partners. And I think what could allow this to actually be successfully implemented is that I've been seeing over the last few weeks industry and governments out of, especially around Asia's area of influence, saying that they're concerned that if tariffs are implemented against China by the U.S., they're going to look for other markets to dump their goods in. And they're talking about implementing their own tariffs against China or considering it. So I think that all of these countries, these trade allies, reaching out to the Trump administration. I think yesterday Trump and Bessent said, and I think also the I forget his name, but the White House economic advisor said that over 75 countries have reached out to the Trump administration to make some kind of trade deal. And more of these trade partners like Thailand, Vietnam, and even Taiwan are saying they want to eliminate trade barriers. So I think right now we're seeing the beginning of the implementation of this strategy to not only contain China in the Indo-Pacific militarily and politically, but also effectively undermine China's industrial base.
Mm-hmm. All right. Sure seems to be the case. I noticed Scott Bessent said, I think yesterday, that the ultimate plan is to approach China as a group, and I guess in that way have some greater leverage. And just as a reminder, one thing I talked about yesterday, Scott Bessent was very clear. He said, in order for the United States to win, China has to manufacture less, and the United States has to manufacture more and also consume less. So it seems to be the strategy, Robert. Thanks for staying on top of that. Let's go ahead and move into today's roll-up items, starting with this domestic terrorism strategy. What's going on?
The DHS said they're going to rescind the Biden administration's domestic terrorism strategy that was published in early 2021. And this was after a Government Accountability Office review released yesterday, pointing out some areas where there could be some reforms of this. The DHS hasn't said why they have rescinded the strategy, but in 2021, when this strategy was implemented by the Biden administration at the time, Merrick Garland, who was the Attorney General, said that it was going to be focused on violence and not ideology. But I think in the meantime, what we've seen come out from not just conservative nonprofits and anti-abortion groups, but also Mark Andreessen in the tech sector, is that it was pretty clear the Biden Department of Justice and FBI were not just implementing anti-violence strategies, but they were targeting people politically and ideologically that they felt were aligned against the Biden administration. Like in the case of the tech sector, they were using the politically exposed persons label to debank a lot of tech executives.
Mm-hmm. Robert, it's not only that, but they're leftists in the United States that continually conduct arson. They burn up cop cars. They perform acts of vandalism and property damage. And that is all for a political effect. I mean, we can define terrorism. The textbook definition of terrorism is violence or coercion against civilian targets for a political effect. So it sure seems like, and listen, I don't stay on top. I can't say that all these arsonists are being arrested or aren't being arrested. But I'll tell you, I read through these far left blogs every day, and it's 2-3 times a week. There's a claim, oh, we burned up this construction material in Oregon or in Georgia, or we destroyed this generator that was used to build Mountain Valley Pipeline in West Virginia. I never hear about this stuff on the news. I never hear about the DOJ going after these people. But it's just funny because the FBI will send agents to a PTA meeting to investigate parents who are angry about what their kids are inappropriate material their kids are reading in the school library. So it sure seems to be like this was political, not just focused on violence, because I did not see the Biden DOJ response to left-wing political violence, property destruction, vandalism, terrorism, if you want to call it that, was not commensurate with the level of activity that it probably deserved. Thanks, Robert. Let's move on to the USDA.
So USDA said the Trump administration is considering a bailout for U.S. farmers if they're impacted by this U.S.-China trade war. Agriculture Secretary Brooke Rollins said that their goal is actually to boost U.S. farmers through an economic realignment, eliminating the need for a bailout. But I also saw that there's this firm called Epic Bankruptcy Analytics, and they said that so far, just this year, 88 family-owned and corporate farms have filed bankruptcy, and this is actually up from 50 in the same period of 2024. Mm-hmm. So I think the potential fallout of this trade war, if there isn't a bailout from the Trump administration like there was during Trump's first term, we could see a lot more consolidation and bankruptcies in the U.S. farm sector.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is a big problem because we're going to see consolidation. We're going to see these large factory farms, industrial farms buy up these what's left of mom and pop farms. And so I think more centralization of our food supply. I think 2020 showed that's probably the wrong way to go. All right, and then let's move on to this Trump executive order on clean energy.
So yesterday, Trump issued another EO, and he's directing the Department of Justice to take what he called all appropriate actions to stop the enforcement of state laws or even state lawsuits against fossil fuel companies. And this is over. I think the goal of this is to curb two things. One, the state climate funds, these state climate change funds, where they're fining fossil fuel companies and utilities over pollution and putting those in their general funds. And two, the spate of lawsuits we saw during the Biden administration, where state and local governments and activist groups are effectively trying to enact national level or possibly even international level energy policy by filing lawsuits against utilities and fossil fuel companies over emissions. So I think this is the primary target of this executive order. But I expect there will be a lot of pushback and lawsuits because the states will argue that this is infringing on their ability to implement policies within state lines. But I think the truth of the matter is a lot of these policies are actually going to have interstate commerce effects.
Mm-hmm. All right. Thanks for that, Robert. And let's see if Jared's audio will work. All right, Jared,
all right,
can you hear me? All right, great. Let's go. I'll just let you take it away with starting with the Chinese diaspora.
Sounds good. So the Chinese Ministries of Education and Tourism are each urging traveling Chinese and Chinese students to conduct risk assessments on their activities in America, particularly the students.
This seems to be pretty counterintuitive, Jared, because there's so many Chinese students who act as either official or kind of de facto intelligence gatherers in the United States. It seems to me like anything China does to undermine this flow of Chinese students into American universities is basically an intelligence failure. So this seems to be more performative than anything, but please continue.
Yes, I completely agree. I wouldn't be shocked to find out that they shortly issue a call to return. Now, so we covered yesterday the Chinese are trying to match their economic response to the U.S. with a diplomatic response to the U.S.'s allies. And the Australian Deputy Prime Minister and the acting South Korean president both publicly rejected Chinese offers to form multilateral trade networks in order to counter American tariffs. And these were in two separate interviews. Now, each politician also expressed a desire to ensure their national security with the U.S. over any anti-U.S. actions. Basically, they are prioritizing security over economics.
Mm-hmm.
All right. And staying with with China still. So yesterday we covered the Ukrainians accusing China of having citizens fighting for Russia, and the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs urged Ukraine to refrain from, quote, irresponsible remarks. They reiterated that they tell their citizens not to fight, and they denied being a participatory party to the war. Now, meanwhile, President Zelensky is claiming that Russia has recruited these citizens through social media and that the Ukrainian Security Service has a list of all of the names, all of the birth dates, and what Russian units they're even participating in. And I think it's worth noting that at no time does the Chinese say, those aren't our people. They never deny that they're Chinese. They just say, oh, no, we didn't send them. And saying, oh, we're not a participating party seems rather dubious. I think especially from a European perspective, because they have been providing dual-use technology to Russia that's been pretty well documented. Staying with the EU, just early this morning, the European president announced that she would match President Trump's 90-day pause on tariffs to give negotiations a chance. Over in Turkey, Russia and the U.S. are meeting today to discuss normalizing relations. This is actually going to be entirely separate from any kind of peace negotiations over Ukraine. So it will be about, hey, let's get Russia and U.S. back to acting diplomatically. And in a similar vein, Turkey and Israel are met in Azerbaijan yesterday to discuss how to avoid an escalating conflict in Syria.
From an international relations perspective, when two parties are talking, it's typically great news. when talks break down and they stop talking, typically bad news. So some good news here. All right, thanks for that, Jared. And let's move on to our warning items. We're going to start here with this Texas and New York judges. Robert, they've blocked Trump deportations. Is this going back to the Supreme Court or what?
Well, I think it is, but I think more importantly, the temporary restraining orders, these two judges, one is in Texas and one is New York. And actually, Rodriguez is a Trump appointee from his first term. Their orders are a lot more measured than we've seen so far. And I think that this is because they are, or I think this is an indicator these district courts could be backing off of these previous expansive temporary restraining orders and nationwide injunctions. I think there's two reasons for this. One, there's Republican legislative effort and budgetary effort to curb these nationwide injunctions. I think the House is supposed to vote in committee on that No Rogue Judges Act. And one of the House Budgetary or House Judiciary Committee, I think the committee chair has wants to push this in the spending bills that are coming up in the end of the year to actually defund some of these nationwide injunction efforts. And I think this Supreme Court decision that pushed these cases down to these two courts from the Washington D.C. case where this originated is basically the Supreme Court kind of slapping the wrist of these district courts a little bit. I think they're heeding what are warning signs that either the Supreme Court or the Congress are going to rein in these district courts if they keep imposing these nationwide orders.
Mm-hmm. All right. And then, so we can continue to expect these federal judges to continue issuing these injunctions with no influence or effect or consequences.
Well, I think that when they do or what we might see after this case and these two judges in New York, one in New York and one in Texas, is that some more of these district courts may start issuing much more limited injunctions that only apply to either their districts or whoever is actually suing, rather than what the strategy from the Trump resistance lawfare strategy has been to file one case and try to, in this one, get a class action so they can get a nationwide injunction to tie up the Trump administration. I think we might see the district courts start going away from that in order to prevent either Trump basically undermining the legitimacy of the courts or the Supreme Court telling them to knock it off in a much more official way, like creating case law saying that district courts cannot even implement these nationwide injunctions.
Mm-hmm. All right. Thanks for that, Robert. And then let's move on here to the last item of the day. Yesterday, there was a question about what happens if the Chinese yuan collapses. We'll bring Jared on. Jared, so you did some research into this. This is pretty interesting. You say of the 7 paper currencies that have been issued by China, off and on for about 1,000 years now, you say the average lifespan of a currency on average is only 65 years. That means it's around for 65 years, and then there's a currency collapse or there's hyperinflation, and then they have to introduce a new currency, or I don't know. Jared, why don't you let's delve a little deeper into this Chinese history.
Will do. So, like you said, it's been off and on for about 1,000 years. It's been government controlled for 1,001 years. Their first issue was 1024, which I find kind of interesting. Now, the 65 and a half years actually includes a pretty significant outlier. The first currency was 252 years old when it collapsed, and it only collapsed due to outside forces making a regime change. So if you remove that outlier, the lifespan actually drops to 34 years. Now, 3 of the 7 currency devaluations also directly ended or contributed to the end of their issuing dynasties, which is an enormous risk for really any country there. Now, during the Ming Dynasty, there was an interesting case where China became dependent on an external currency. They were dependent on Spanish silver entering the country in order to facilitate Chinese commerce. This worked great for almost 2 centuries, and then the Spanish stopped sending silver over, which resulted in near immediate hyperinflation and rebellion. Like within 2 years, they were experiencing rebellion, and if I remember right, it was within 3 years they were in just an absolute free fall on hyperinflation.
Mhm.
So looking at the statistics from the record, China has about a 43% chance of regime change if the devaluation of yuan goes too far.
Okay, where does that number
That is
come
the
from? Just from
3 out of 7 hyperinflation scenarios in China's records resulted in the collapse of the dynasty.
okay, yeah. And by the way, China is no stranger to dynastic collapse. I mean, all throughout Chinese history, you have these dynasties coming and going.
Mhm.
Even though some of them have reached, I think, great cultural and military heights. Several have collapsed, and they've been quite difficult. That Ming Qing transition, the collapse of the Ming dynasty, and into the Qing dynasty, pretty tumultuous time. Also, all right. So sorry to cut you off, Jared, but you say just based on history, 43% chance of regime change if the currency collapses. Please continue.
Yes. Now, when they don't collapse, China normally stabilizes itself by issuing a commodity-based currency, which has been talked about fairly frequently with the BRICS currency. But China's currently, at least as far as I can tell as a layman, they're currently dependent on a foreign currency, the dollar, to conduct trade, which props up its internal economy. The only other time that's happened, so for 100% of the times this has happened, that killed the issuing dynasty, the Ming dynasty. Now, I think economically, it's probably safe to say that the Ming dynasty was probably more secure than the current Chinese administration, just because the Ming dynasty had almost 2 centuries of prosperity using that foreign currency. The CCP does not. So when you look at both of these phenomena, I think Trump's trade war may not only contain China, but I think it has a statistically high chance of outright breaking them. And that would make this existential, which you talked about Copeland's thesis about economic interdependence and negative trade outlooks. I think that comes sharply into view, and we are at a very serious risk of China reacting violently just to preserve itself.
Mm-hmm. I've also seen some China analysts say that when the Chinese get backed into a corner, they react violently, and so their argument is we should expect some military action by China, maybe against Taiwan, maybe against someone else, Vietnam, Philippines, I don't know, but that sure seems to be likely to trigger a much larger Indo-Pacific war, especially considering you have all these. Jared, it just seems to me unlikely because this is probably not a war China's going to win.
Yeah, well, I completely agree that I don't think they can win it by force. It looks like they can't win it by trade, but what choice do they have? It's kind of the same thing you mentioned as far as tariffs a few days ago. With, well, if we're gonna sell out our kids, what choice do we have? We have to make some kind of move, and I think the Chinese are going to feel very similarly, where it's, well, if we do nothing, we never achieve rejuvenation, and we risk losing everything. If we do something, we might win, but we might also lose everything. So it's kind of a catch-22 for the Chinese.
Mm-hmm. All right. 3 out of 7, not good odds. I think I look at 7 and I say, well, that's kind of a small sample size. But Jared, this is a very interesting history about Chinese dynasty collapse occurring directly after currency failure. And it has been because China has simply printed too much currency in these cases. All right, Jared, very interesting. And thank you for that. Let's get into today's questions. I don't know if Jared could tee these up or not, but here I'll go ahead. China change from the Communist Party to what if the dynasty collapses? I don't know. If War with China does happen, what is the likelihood that casualties will be so high as to demand a draft in the United States? Jared, this is something that we have talked about. What happens if China sinks an American carrier and you have how many thousands of sailors are on a carrier?
It's 3,000 to 5,000, depending on the model of carrier. But if you're sinking the carrier, you've killed the strike group, and you're looking at about 10,000 in a strike group.
Okay, all right.
Or sorry, not 10. That would include quite a few other things as well. It would be more like 7,000.
Okay, all right. So not an impossibility considering what we know China's strategy is in terms of just overwhelming these ships' defenses. So I don't see. I just got to be honest. I don't think anyone has the political capital to go forward with a draft to go fight a war with China. I could be completely wrong. I don't think that's realistic. I bet that's my initial reaction. How about you?
I also don't think that there's political capital for that. I think the defense architecture that we've covered pretty extensively here will help accommodate for any kind of losses. I would be amazed if the Indo-Pacific wasn't preparing to lose a strike group, but keeping in mind that there are 4 dedicated ones to the Indo-Pacific and several amphibious strike groups. On paper, this is grim, but we could afford to lose one.
Mm-hmm. All right. This may be a case where, well, Jared, let me ask you, do you think this is a case where, we said we were willing to allow Ukraine to fight to the last Ukrainian? Are we going to allow or enable Japan to fight to the last Japanese and Philippines to the last Filipino and whoever else, Australia, whoever else gets involved?
For Japan, Taiwan, and the Philippines, that's out of our hands. All 3 of them have tied their existence to this matter. But all 3 of them consider Chinese to be such a threat, like any kind of change of the status quo, that's why they're willing to tie themselves to an unofficial country like Taiwan.
Mm-hmm. All right. Frozen Nomad asks the next question: what's China's next move after these tariff raises? Well, we're still working on that. I'll tell you, but the next question is, are they able to perform a significant currency devaluation without major domestic draws? One thing I've noticed is that the Chinese, his name's Lee, Chinese, I don't know if he's a financial minister or what, but he came out recently, yesterday, and said that, I said pretty much what he's been saying, is that there's a huge focus on boosting domestic demand for all these Chinese goods, since there's falling demand abroad due to these tariffs. Jared, have you seen anything else come out of China on that front?
Not from China, no.
Okay. All right. And what is the likelihood that this trade war leads to a kinetic war? Well, that's a great question. Let me pull out some math. I didn't mention this on the show yesterday, but I went back to that Copeland book by, is it John Copeland? Last name's Copeland. Economic Interdependence and War. And just looking through here, according to the author's research, here's the math. When future trade expectations turn negative among great powers, it led to international crisis or armed conflict in 65% of the 40 cases examined. When you break that down and you consider only cases involving economic interdependence between great powers, then that number rises to nearly 90%, or 26 out of 30 cases. So there's a lot of history behind the argument that this does lead to a kinetic war. On top of, I think we're probably trending that way anyway. I guess this is a question of timing. Jared, you and I were talking after the show yesterday, and for any action on Taiwan, I guess we just lost Jared. All right, any action on Taiwan, there are really 2 good windows. There's 2 good windows for an amphibious assault. One in the spring, I think it's like April, May, and then one in the fall, which is the better of the 2 windows. And that has to do with weather. It has to do with currents. And those are the times when the weather is conducive or more conducive towards an amphibious invasion. I don't think any of us expect an invasion of Taiwan, but one thing we have been talking about since 2022 is a blockade of Taiwan. And this is something that the Chinese military has been practicing with these exercises repeatedly, large-scale exercises. They are clearly demonstrating the ability. That does not depend on the weather. That can happen at any time. So I would just end by saying this. A blockade, a military blockade of Taiwan could happen at any time. There's a lot of history that says this does go kinetic, just historically. which is not a 100% indicator, but it helps us form a baseline of what to expect or what potentially to expect, or how often these conflicts do occur. And roughly they occur in 90% of the cases throughout the past 300, maybe 400 years. So it's something we'll obviously continue to pay deeper attention to. All right, we'll do a couple other questions here. What is the likelihood of radical American leftists collaboration with the, say, Chinese special operations? Well, foreign external support, foreign financing, foreign training, foreign provided material support is pretty common in low intensity conflict, especially insurgency. External support, having a foreign backer of an insurgency is extremely common, and in many cases that has been the deciding factor in victory or defeat for insurgencies. In short, I don't know. I'm not sure how much foreign support these leftist groups are getting. That is above my pay grade. That would be something over at like Treasury, may be able to tell you, or FBI, I guess. I don't know. But, historically, actually, let's go back to this. In December 2020, the U.S. Army published a facility security research paper. And what they said was they did not name China. But you read this and you're like, well, that's China. They said that foreign actors would attack the homeland conventionally and unconventionally. So when we talk about conventional warfare, we're talking about tanks and bombers and missiles. It's not talking about an invasion. I'm just saying conventional action against U.S. military assets would be conventional war. And also unconventionally. And unconventionally, typically you're using the indigenous population of a country to attack the government, a foreign-backed insurgency. And so they said, in addition to attacking via cyber attacks against critical infrastructure, foreign nations would also seek to use protest groups and transnational criminal organizations. I'm not saying we will get to this point, but this is not some weirdo YouTuber. This is the U.S. Army saying, in terms of U.S. Army facility security, threats include essentially Chinese-backed transnational criminal organizations, so MS-13, Trinidad, Aragua, et cetera, and protest groups. And so is there a case where China could support left-wing domestic terrorism against the United States? Yeah, I think there is a case. I'm not sure right now how likely that is, but is it possible? Yes, it is possible. All right, we'll get to a couple other questions here. Jared, if you've rejoined us, here's one. Just trying to have tactical nuclear anti-ship weapons that could attack a carrier strike group.
If you don't mind, next question.
Okay, we're not going to go there. All right, we'll do this last question. What are the likely steps the U.S. will take if China blockades Taiwan? How will that play out? Jared, you and I have talked about the possibility. I think actually some Indo-Pacific admiral actually talked about, actually said the United States Navy does have the capability to penetrate a Chinese blockade to Taiwan. What say you?
Yes, I completely agree that there's the ability. The U.S. Navy can break a blockade. I think the more important question is what our allies are doing, and the U.S. can take many more steps once you realize that the Philippines is likely going to threaten China's main vector of attack down in Kaohsiung, which is just north of the Philippines. That's going to significantly weaken China's ability to blockade really anything. That Kaohsiung's their main port, not Taipei. Taipei is just their capital. It is still an important port, but it's also just their capital. So as far as how will that play out, I expect a lot of non-kinetic action within probably the first week, When you see the Japanese, they're preparing for evacuations down near Taiwan. Philippines will probably do the same thing, but theirs is easier because most of it's over land. And following on from that, there is a port on the Pacific side of Taiwan that I expect to be set up as basically the breaking of the blockade. And now China will have a carrier strike group out in that area just based on the exercises we've seen them run. We will probably get to see a what modern carrier strike group versus carrier strike group warfare looks like in the first few weeks, because that you have to destroy that or remove it in order to properly break the blockade. It's, as far as a time frame before kinetic warfare, I would give it less than a week.
And that just because it takes time to push ships into the region.
Yes, and there's going to be some very last minute diplomatic moves. Hey, don't do this. You need to open this up. Let's negotiate our way out of this. Nobody's going to want to enter this war, because the moment you do, you run the risk of this getting catastrophic, especially if the Chinese did actually make the conventional intercontinental ballistic missile. The risk of nuclear war goes through the roof, because they're doing that to reciprocate homeland strikes. And there's no way to tell whether that ICBM is going to wipe out a city block or if it's going to wipe out a city.
All right. Jared, last question here. I think this was you. You noticed over on Twitter that the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Chinese state-backed social media accounts have started posting videos of Mao. Basically, Mao talking about revolutionary warfare and, we fight, whatever. That sure seems like a pretty strong message. Am I reading that correctly?
Yes. It is always a little hard to tell with the Chinese, because you can't tell when they're serious. Pretty famous Russian saying is China's final warning is just the final one till the next one. Basically, they will try to present a strong face in all cases. So yes, they'll take somebody like Mao.
Strong when weak. Mm-hmm.
Well, even when they are strong, they will also try to appear strong, which I know is kind of counterintuitive for basically anyone that's read Sun Tzu, but they still do attempt to, because they don't want to appear weak. They want to be the center of civilization. They want to be strong and be perceived as strong.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, listen, this is a developing situation. We'll obviously stay on top of it. Jared, thanks so much for your insight. Robert, also, thank you for staying on top of domestic conditions. That's going to do it for today's show. Everyone, we appreciate your support. If you'd like access to our special reports, we'll be publishing them on Chinese course of actions. We'll probably take a much harder look at how this could escalate actually into an armed conflict, whether it will. If you'd like access to those special reports, head over to www.earlywarningnetwork.com. Sign up. You can start with a free 7-day trial, get access to all of our reporting, also access to our intelligence platform and a community discussing these things and also sharing information, which is extremely helpful. And with that, everyone, thanks. Lastly, thanks so much for the support. We'll be back in your inbox tomorrow morning, back on this show starting at 08 Central Time. Until then, be well and stay out front. Oh, yeah, I'm running the show.